The year was 1876 Kansas, a land of open skies, endless prairie, and the illusion of freedom. But beneath the vast horizon, secrets rot quietly, secrets so dark that the ground itself seems cursed to remember what men dare not speak. Imagine this: a widow, dressed in black, standing at the altar for the 12th time. 12 men had once stood beside her, each promising her forever. Yet not a single one had a grave. No crosses marked their passing, no stones bore their names, only silence, ledger lines, and the steady reappearance of her own name, unchanging, untouched by grief, untouched by time. Whispers rose in the prairie towns. They called her cursed, but curses leave marks. These men left nothing, no bodies, no records of death, just erasure. Neighbors recalled wagons creaking down her lane, horses tethered to her posts, men climbing down with boots heavy from travel, shoulders burdened by trunks and tools. Yet never once did anyone see them leave. It was as if the earth swallowed them whole the moment they crossed her threshold. A neighbor's son, years later, told his children, the sound of a wagon arriving meant a man had been claimed. After that, silence. The first was a soldier, fresh from war, scarred but hopeful. They wed in 1858. The county clerk wrote his name in clean, neat script. 6 months later, his name vanished from all records. No death certificate, no burial, no probate. He was there on one line of the ledger, bound to her, and then erased from existence. In those days, men disappeared all the time. Wanderers, deserters, dreamers chasing fortune further west. But not like this. In the county's books, even the lost left shadows. Unknown, missing, deceased. Something to fill the gap. His gap had nothing, as though the ink had dried only long enough to vanish again. The second husband, a farmer with calloused hands, was buried according to a receipt. The church received payment for his grave. Yet no stone marked it. No caretaker remembered digging it. The receipt was the only trace, a slip of paper that stood where a body never had. She remained, her name steady in the census. Widow, always widow, young, alone, yet untouched by tragedy's visible stain. It was not grief that followed her. It was silence. Neighbors began to notice the stillness of her home. Windows shuttered in the daytime, no smoke from the chimney, no laughter, no voices, just quiet, as though the house itself were waiting. Children walking past dared each other to peer in. Some swore they saw her staring back, unblinking, as if expecting them. Others said they heard nothing, no footsteps, no breathing, no sign of life at all. And yet men kept arriving. Drawn by what? Her beauty? Her land? Her silence that seemed to promise safety? Whatever it was, they entered and never returned. By the 1860s, the pattern stretched across the land itself. Husbands' names appeared briefly on deeds and tax rolls before vanishing, their farms transferred to her name with eerie efficiency. The signatures on those deeds bore a troubling uniformity, the curves, the flourishes, identical, as though one hand had guided them all. Specialists later whispered of forgery, but the courts never touched it. The land stayed hers, the men did not. Her neighbors called it inevitability. She was no longer unlucky. She was inevitable, a widow not once, not twice, but a dozen times over. Every decade's census stamped the same word beside her name. Widow, widow, widow. It was not a descriptor anymore. It was her identity. Like ink branding her to a fate no man could escape. But the unease deepened when outsiders began to investigate. A doctor sworn to secrecy claimed she did not age between 1860 and 1875. Her skin remained unlined, her figure unchanged. He called it unnatural, a condition of body or perhaps of something far older. In the final letter one husband wrote to his mother, he warned, "If I go quiet, do not come searching." He knew. They all must have known. Yet they stayed. Why? Perhaps because men are arrogant. They believe curses can be broken, that danger bends to desire. Each thought he would be the one to survive her shadow. Each was wrong. By 1878, newspapers had caught the story. The presses called her the widow of graves unmarked. Some called her cursed, others whispered witch, but the truth was far stranger. For curses leave signs, witches leave rituals. She left only silence, no bodies, no graves, just paper trails ending in erasure, land shifting hands, and the black-eyed stare of a woman who lived untouched through it all. And then, in 1880, even she vanished. Not buried, not recorded as dead. Her census entry was replaced with a cold, mechanical phrase, transferred, location withheld, a phrase that appears nowhere else in the county records, a phrase that does not belong to death but to disappearance. She too stepped off the page of history, leaving only the echo of 12 husbands gone without graves. And behind her, only silence, a silence that devours. Now before we open what remains of her ledger, the scraps of receipts, the missing graves, the whispers that still cling to Kansas soil, I want you to tell me something. In the comments, write where in the world you are watching from and what time of night or day it is where you sit. Because tonight, you will descend into the kind of story that rewrites the way you see history. A story of silence, erasure, and power buried deeper than any grave. A story that, once heard, will not let you go. The ledger does not lie, but it does not always tell the whole truth either. Paper has a way of concealing as much as it reveals. To study her story is to study silence, not just the silence of neighbors too afraid to speak, but the silence of institutions that should have resisted, should have questioned, should have preserved the traces of those men. Instead, they folded into her shadow. Clerks, priests, county judges, each left gaps so clean, so deliberate, it is difficult to believe they were accidents. Look first at the deeds. In a frontier world where land was power, every acre mattered. Farmers lived and died by their property. When a man vanished, the land usually became contested. Brothers argued, creditors swarmed, widows fought for a fraction of security. But in her case, no disputes arose. No siblings appeared to demand their due. No banks filed claims. Instead, the land slipped silently into her name, as if fate itself were notarized. And the signatures? Too perfect. Handwriting specialists who reviewed surviving records described a chilling consistency. Each husband's name bent with the same flourishes, the same weight of pen, as though the hand that guided them was never truly theirs. Even when the land shifted mid-season, mid-harvest, the county clerks did not question. They entered her name with the same steady hand they used for every farmer and widow, as though they too believed she was inevitable. The church too played its role. A burial receipt without a grave should have raised alarm. Priests, sextons, parishioners, all complicit in their silence. Did they know? Did they suspect? Or did they simply fear? A pew left empty, Sunday after Sunday, beside her seated form. Men disappeared, yet sermons carried on. Baptisms were recorded, marriages sanctified, but death, the most ritualized passage of frontier life, was denied its witness. No funerals, no mourning, no stone. The very rituals that gave death meaning were denied to her husbands. Instead, they were erased, while she remained among the living, her presence never questioned by the congregation that saw her each week. By the late 1860s, whispers hardened into fear. People no longer asked why her husbands vanished. They asked instead how she continued unscathed. Some suggested poison, others dark ritual. But deeper minds saw something more disturbing. Institutions bent around her. She was not merely a woman with bad fortune or sinister cunning. She was a nexus, where law, church, and community turned blind. And that blindness spread like rot. Consider this. In 1873, a man named Elias Turner, her seventh husband, vanished just as the harvest came in. His disappearance should have brought the sheriff to her door. Instead, the sheriff filed nothing. The man was marked absent, no more than that. The sheriff's own brother attended her next wedding. Coincidence? Or evidence of a bond deeper than suspicion? The county's silence was not accidental. It was protective. And what of the doctor? His testimony, written decades later in a private journal, unsettles most of all. He claimed she did not age, that between 1860 and 1875 her appearance remained unchanged. The same skin, the same dark eyes, the same unbroken youth. He called it unnatural, but he did not testify, he did not warn. He recorded it quietly, in words never meant for a courtroom. Why? Because to accuse her was to invite disappearance, and the doctor valued survival more than truth. Institutions thrive on repetition, births, deaths, marriages, taxes. But in her case, repetition became weapon. Census after census, widow, ledger after ledger, land transfer, receipt after receipt, grave without body. The pattern was there for anyone to see, yet no one acted. Why? Perhaps because the community had begun to believe something darker, that she was not simply living within the system, but that the system itself served her, as if she were part of an order far older, far more commanding than any county clerk or priest, an order that demanded silence in exchange for survival. And here is the most chilling thought. What if she was not alone? What if her story is only the fragment that survived, the exposed corner of a larger design? Because institutions do not bend for one woman, they bend for power. And in Kansas, in the 19th century, power flowed quietly through hidden channels, railroads rising, banks consolidating, land hungry for consolidation. And at the edges, families erased, husbands gone without graves, their property quietly absorbed. Her name stands in the open, but behind her, a silence too vast to belong to one woman alone. The deeper you stare into her ledger, the more you realize it was never about her beauty, her curse, or her cunning. It was about control, the removal of men, the silencing of their names, the folding of their land into her possession, and her possession into something even larger. She was a gatekeeper of sorts, perhaps willing, perhaps bound, perhaps cursed in truth. But the system protected her because she was useful to it. Useful to the kind of power that thrives when no one asks where the bodies are. So when you hear her called cursed, understand this. Curses are personal, private afflictions. This was systemic. She was inevitable because the institutions that surrounded her made her inevitable. A sheriff who closed his eyes, a priest who buried only on paper, a clerk who signed with her hand. Together they built a silence that devoured 12 men and left nothing but her name, steady and eternal, across 2 decades of history. And when the census of 1880 replaced her name with the words transferred, location withheld, it was not a clerical error. It was a command, a removal not into death but into secrecy. As if the very system she had served now consumed her in turn, erasing her as neatly as the men before her. Where she went, no one knows. But if you listen closely, you will feel it. The pull of silence. A silence that does not belong to death, but to power. The kind of silence that swallows history whole. There is a difference between forgetting and being made to forget. In the story of the cursed widow, the community did not simply overlook the vanished men. They were conditioned into silence, conditioned into erasure. And that is the most unsettling element of all, how a people learn to look away from the abyss even as it consumes their neighbors. Imagine the prairie town in the late 1860s, a small congregation, one dusty church, a single general store, gossip and rumor woven into the fabric of survival. Here nothing went unnoticed. A wagon rolling down a lane was news. A new family on a homestead was discussion for weeks. And yet, a dozen men vanished and the community acted as though it were natural. They whispered, yes, but whispers are powerless when never carried into the open. The sheriff filed no reports. Families of the men never pressed the issue. Even the children who should have asked the most dangerous questions were taught to stay silent. That is not chance. That is control. A control older than Kansas, older than the frontier itself. For when silence repeats across generations, it becomes ritual, and rituals feed power. The oral histories collected decades later capture this transformation. Farmers recalled the stillness of her home but did not describe it as threatening. Instead, they described inevitability, as though she were a season. Men arrived like autumn winds, and by spring they were gone. It was her way, one farmer's grandson said, and the county knew better than to ask. Do you hear it? That is not superstition. That is compliance. That is a community conditioned into believing that disappearance is natural, that erasure is safe. Look closer at the details. When men left, their brothers did not search. Their parents did not ride to her door demanding truth. Letters to families ended abruptly, but no one pursued them. Why? Because people were taught that pursuit was dangerous, that those who asked questions would themselves vanish, and perhaps some did. A witness silenced before he could speak. A brother swallowed before he could testify. The silence was not absence, it was enforcement. Memory itself began to twist. Children grew into adults who no longer remembered the names of the missing husbands. They remembered only her, the widow who always remained, a house always occupied by one, never by two. It became a story stripped of faces, reduced to inevitability. Men came, men went. She stayed. Over time, the men ceased to exist as individuals. They became shadows attached to her. That is psychological control at its purest form, transforming victims into symbols, then erasing the symbols themselves until only the perpetrator remains. But who was teaching them to forget? Who benefited from the erasure of men who should have left heirs, families, land disputes? The trail of land transfers provides one answer. The properties accumulated under her name were not kept forever. Some were later sold, parceled, absorbed into the growing consolidation of Kansas land as railroads carved through the frontier. Investors, banks, companies, Eastern men of capital, gained what the vanished had once owned. Their silence was purchased with acres. Their power grew as hers expanded and then dissolved. And this is the deeper pattern. Communities do not simply allow silence. They are groomed into it by forces greater than themselves. In her case, the widow was the visible vessel, but behind her, institutions that thrived on silence. The courthouse that processed her deeds without contest, the church that took payment for burials without graves, the press that waited until the 9th marriage to print her story, by which time it was already too late. This is not the story of one cursed woman. This is the story of how entire systems conspire to erase memory. Think about this. A doctor swore she did not age. Do you know what that means, psychologically, to a community? To see a woman remain unchanged while men vanish around her is to confront the unnatural. And when humans confront the unnatural, they have two choices: face it or bury it. Most bury it. It is easier to lie to oneself, to call it curse or misfortune, than to name it conspiracy. Easier to forget than to see. That is why she survived, not just because men vanished, but because she became an idea, a symbol of inevitability. And you cannot fight inevitability, you can only submit. And yet, within the cracks of silence, fragments survived. A brother who wrote, "This matter is not for court nor for scripture." A husband who warned in a letter, "If I go quiet, do not come searching." These are not the words of men afraid of death. These are the words of men who knew they were being erased. They tried to speak, but their words were scattered, faint echoes against the roar of silence. The system made sure of it. You see, history is not only shaped by what is remembered, it is shaped by what is deliberately forgotten. And in Kansas, 1876, forgetting became survival. To ask questions was to vanish. To stay silent was to live. Communities chose silence. Institutions enforced it. And in the process, the widow's story became not simply one of missing men, but of missing memory. She became immortal, not because she defied age, but because the men who should have anchored her story were stripped from it. Their absence became her power. Now, I want you to pause, because here is where we test your awareness. If you are still with me, if you feel the pull of this forbidden knowledge sinking deeper into your bones, then prove you are not one of the silenced. In the comments below, write the phrase, "Graves without names," not once, but twice. Write it as a mark, a signal that you will not be erased, that you will not forget what others tried to bury, because to repeat at the phrase is to resist the silence, and resistance is the first step in transformation. What if she was never the architect of this silence at all? What if she was the vessel, the chosen mask, of a force older than Kansas, older than the frontier, older than even the paper that recorded her? To think of her only as a cunning widow is to mistake the shadow for the hand that casts it, because the deeper you look, the more the pattern reveals something far greater than one woman's will. It reveals ritual. Consider the structure of her story. 12 men, taken one after another, each within months of binding themselves to her. No graves, no funerals, no closure. Each disappearance synchronized with the legal transfer of land, with the silencing of names, with the erasure of memory. That is not randomness, that is sequence, that is ritual precision. Every society that has ever existed has practiced sacrifice. Sometimes it is animals, sometimes it is men. Sometimes it is the very act of erasing memory, of destroying the trace of life so completely that no record of it can survive. And here in Kansas, between 1858 and 1880, sacrifice wore the mask of a woman in black. She became the Axis. But the ritual belonged to something else. Think of the institutions once more. The county that processed deeds without question. The church that allowed burials on paper but not in soil. The sheriff who filed nothing. Do you see it now? They were not failing in their duties. They were fulfilling them. Each played a part in a ritual disguised as bureaucracy. The marriage license, the land deed, the burial receipt. Ordinary instruments of civil life, repurposed into tools of disappearance. It is the perfect concealment. Sacrifice hidden within paperwork, blood veiled by ink. And what of the doctor's testimony that she did not age, that she remained unchanged for nearly 2 decades? Was she truly untouched by time, or was she replaced, renewed, re-inhabited each time a husband vanished? Perhaps the silence was not hers to come, manned. Perhaps it was hers to endure. Perhaps she was not the predator, but the vessel through which the ritual fed. 12 men gone not to her appetite, but to something that required her presence as cover, her youth as mask, her inevitability as design. Across America in the 19th century, similar stories appear like fragments of a torn manuscript. Wives who outlive every husband, families who vanish without graves, institutions that record the living but omit the dead. In isolation, each story seems like folklore, superstition, small-town gossip, but when you set them side by side, a pattern emerges. Erasure is not accident, it is system, and the system feeds something we do not name, something older than law, something older than church. You think of America in that century as a place of progress, railroads, telegraphs, the advance of frontier. But progress is never free. Every mile of track, every acre consolidated into banks, was purchased not just with labor, but with silence. Whole families erased so their land could pass upward, whole towns absorbed so their names could be lost. She, the cursed widow, is only the piece we see, the fragment preserved. But behind her is the machine of history itself, a machine that devours men and buries truth beneath paper. And yet, her story contains a strange anomaly, because while her husbands were erased, she remained. She carried forward, visible in census after census, unchallenged, unquestioned, her name surviving where theirs dissolved. Why? Why preserve her? Why not erase her too? The answer is as disturbing as it is revealing. The vessel must remain for the ritual to continue. The mask must endure so the sacrifice can repeat. She was not erased because she was needed. She was the portal through which the silence fed. To remove her would have been to break the sequence. That is why she remained ageless, inevitable, a figure both ordinary and supernatural, until at last, in 1880, her function ended. The phrase transferred, location withheld, was not death. It was the closing of a chapter, the mask removed, the vessel retired. But do not mistake her vanishing as liberation. It was absorption. When the machine was finished with her, it erased her as it had erased them. She was never in control. She was controlled. A pawn in a ritual that used her face as cover, her marriages as stages, her name as ink to conceal the disappearance of men who should have remained in history, but were instead consumed. And here is the most chilling possibility. The ritual did not end with her. It only shifted masks. How many widows after her carried the same inevitability? How many small towns whispered of men who vanished, of land that slipped quietly into the hands of banks, of graves that were never dug? How many of these women were not witches, not curses, not predators, but vessels? The truth is dangerous because it overturns the story you are meant to believe, the story of progress, of records, of institutions preserving order. That story is false. Institutions do not preserve, they erase. They decide what survives and what vanishes. And when you see her not as one woman but as evidence of a pattern, you understand. Silence is not chance. It is design. This is why her name, more than the names of the men, survived, because she was the mask of the system. And when the system no longer needed her, it wrote her out with the same cold efficiency it had used on 12 men before. Not as death, not as scandal, but as bureaucracy. Transferred, location withheld. It reads like nothing, but it means everything. It is the ritual completing itself. By now you feel the pull of her story. A widow, 12 men gone without graves, her name the only survivor. But what you must understand is this. Her case was not isolated. It was not a strange, unlucky corner of Kansas folklore. It was the frontier revealing its true face. Her story is a fragment of a wider pattern, one woven through the very bones of America in the 19th century. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. America has always buried more than it has built. For every mile of track laid across the prairie, there were bodies left unmarked. Families erased from ledgers, whole communities folded into silence. You are told that history is progress, that records preserve truth. But history is a stage, and what you are shown is only the script approved by those who direct it. Behind the curtain, the machine runs on disappearance. Railroads are the clearest example. In the 1860s and 70s, corporations rose like steel gods, swallowing land from farmers who could not keep pace. How convenient, then, that so many farms fell vacant, husbands vanished, widows signed away deeds, clerks processed transfers without contest. And who purchased the land? Not the widows, not the neighbors, the companies. Railroads stretched their lines through Kansas, through Missouri, through every state that bled families into silence. And every rail, every tie, was soaked in the absence of those who had been erased. Banks worked the same design. In small towns, the disappearance of a man meant the disappearance of his debts. Convenient, isn't it? When no heirs came forward, when no one contested, the land could be claimed, parceled, resold. Entire fortunes were built not on honest labor, but on erasure. And what better cover for erasure than a widow who remained, steady, inevitable, always signing the next page? Her story becomes more chilling when you place it alongside others. In Illinois, a family of 6 recorded in the 1865 census simply vanished by 1870. Their land was reassigned, their graves unmarked. In Tennessee, a cluster of disappearances followed the expansion of cotton mills. Workers gone, families dissolved, land absorbed. In each case, institutions preserved just enough record to show continuity while blotting out the truth. Marriages without deaths, transfers without probate, burials without graves. The same pattern, the same ritual of silence. The widow in Kansas is remembered because she was visible, her name repeated across 12 marriages, a pattern too bold to fully hide. But how many others were quieter, dispersed, hidden in fragments across counties? Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, lost to this system of selective forgetting. The railroad tycoons, the banks, the county clerks. They did not need to murder with their own hands. The system itself was designed to consume, to erase, to silence. And what of the communities? They adapted. They learned to accept the inexplicable as ordinary. A wagon in, no wagon out. What could be done? A man gone, a widow remaining. Was it not safer to stay silent? Fear became tradition. Tradition became ritual, and ritual became history. This is how power sustains itself, not by brute force, but by shaping memory, by teaching people to accept disappearance as natural, inevitable, unquestioned. But here lies the deeper terror. If the widow was a vessel, a mask of the system, then what fed through her was not only the hunger for land or wealth, it was the hunger to erase men, to dissolve their names, to silence their legacies. That is more than economic, that is spiritual. Erasure is a ritual of dominance. To strip a man not only of life but of memory, to leave no grave, no trace, no story. This is the ultimate form of control. It is worse than death. It is annihilation. That is why her story unsettles you even now, because deep inside, you know the machine has not stopped. Erasure continues. Institutions still decide what is remembered and what vanishes. Archives still close their doors on truths too dangerous to preserve. Families still vanish from records when their land becomes valuable. You are told it is chance, tragedy, bad luck. But you know better. The machine is still running. Her story is the key that unlocks this recognition. She is the visible crack in the facade, the one case that could not be buried completely. 12 husbands, gone without graves, a phrase in the census that does not belong. Transferred, location withheld. And behind it all, the institutions that played their parts like actors in a ritual. This is why we call it forbidden history. Because once you see the pattern, you cannot go back to believing in coincidence. You cannot tell yourself it was just misfortune. You know now that erasure is systemic, that silence is designed, that history is not a record of truth, but of decisions about what to remember and what to bury. And here is where the descent sharpens. If the widow was a vessel, then someone or something chose her. Chose her face, her form, her inevitability, chose her as the mask through which the ritual of erasure could flow, and when her function was complete, she too was erased, just like the men she had outlived, not as death, not as scandal, but as bureaucracy, transferred, location withheld. The question you must ask yourself is this: how many other masks has the system worn? How many faces have been chosen across centuries, across nations, to perform the same ritual of disappearance? And how many do we still see today? Smiling faces in newspapers, clean signatures on documents, ordinary people who are not individuals at all, but vessels through which silence continues its work. There is a point where repetition becomes prophecy. When an event happens once, it is chance. Twice, it is coincidence. But by the time it happens a third, a fourth, a fifth time, people stop questioning and begin accepting, and by the 12th, they no longer see it as something that happened, they see it as something that must happen. That is the psychology of inevitability, and it is the most insidious form of control. The widow's story reveals this with terrifying clarity. Imagine the men who courted her. Each one knew the whispers. Each one had heard the tales of wagons that rolled in, but never out. Each knew that others before him had vanished, their graves never marked, their names never carried forward. And yet, they came, they married her, they walked into her home and shut the door behind them, convinced that they would be the exception. That is the power of inevitability. It does not repel, it entices. Men believe they can master it. They mistake silence for weakness. They see the pattern but tell themselves it belongs to others, not to them. And so, one after another, they surrendered willingly to the silence that consumed them. Communities behaved the same way. At first, whispers carried unease. Why does every man vanish? But after enough repetitions, the question shifted. Which man will vanish next? It no longer mattered why. The inevitability became its own explanation. Fear hardened into acceptance, and acceptance is the death of resistance. Think about the way her neighbors described her decades later, not as a villain, not even as a witch, but as inevitable, as though she were a season of life itself, like harvest or winter. She was not cursed, one or an. LeCount recalled, she was simply what happened. That sentence chills the blood. To describe human disappearance as simply what happened is to reveal how thoroughly fear had broken them. They no longer thought of her as a woman. They thought of her as a force, a law of nature. And you cannot fight nature. You endure it, you survive it, or you vanish. This is the true power of psychological control. It does not require armies. It does not require violence in the open. It requires only repetition. Once the pattern is established, people enslave themselves to it. They walk willingly into the silence, believing it cannot be resisted, and institutions, those cold hands of law, church and state, enforce it not by shouting, but by confirming it in quiet ink. Widow, widow, widow. Transfer, transfer, transfer. Each word another nail in the coffin of resistance. And here lies the most disturbing truth. Inevitability is not passive, it feeds. Each man who surrendered to her strengthened the legend. Each disappearance reinforced the silence. The more the pattern repeated, the more power it gained, until no one could remember a time before it. That is why inevitability is the perfect prison. It does not need walls, it builds itself from memory. Even the husbands felt it. Read their fragments of testimony and you see it in their words. One wrote to his mother, "If I go quiet, do not come searching." That is not simply fear, that is surrender. He had already accepted his disappearance as fact. He had internalized inevitability. He knew he was not the exception. He knew he would vanish, and still he stayed. That is the psychology of ritual. Men do not need to be dragged into sacrifice. They step into it themselves, convinced that the silence is larger than their will. This pattern stretches beyond her story, into the marrow of America itself. How many men signed away their names to railroads, convinced they were joining progress, only to be discarded and forgotten? How many soldiers marched into wars, convinced of their survival, only to have their bodies left unmarked and their names erased from rosters? How many workers entered factories, mines, mills, believing themselves the exception to danger, only to vanish into statistics? Each one fed the inevitability of a system designed to consume them. Each one believed, and each one was wrong. The widow was only the mask. The deeper truth is this: inevitability is the system itself. It is the weapon of power. Repetition creates surrender. Silence creates belief, and once belief hardens, no one resists. That is why her husbands disappeared so easily. That is why her community fell silent. That is why her story became legend instead of rebellion. You must understand, inevitability is not real. It is manufactured. It is repetition weaponized, but once it takes root, it is stronger than steel, stronger than guns, stronger than armies, because it controls the mind, and a controlled mind does not fight. It obeys. It erases itself. So when you hear her story, do not think only of a cursed widow. Think of yourself. Ask, what inevitabilities have you been taught to accept? What repetitions have trained you to surrender? What silences have conditioned you to believe that erasure is natural? Because if you do not ask, you are already inside the pattern. You are already feeding it. We have spoken of the men she outlived, the land she absorbed, the silence that surrounded her. But there is one question left smoldering beneath the surface, one most historians refuse to ask. Was she ever free, or was she as much a prisoner of inevitability as those who vanished? It is easy, too easy, to cast her as predator, as witch, as schemer. 12 husbands gone, their names erased, her own name repeated as if carved into stone. But look closer. She does not appear in receipts, in land disputes, in burial notes. Only in the censuses, year after year, stamped with the word widow. No testimony in her own hand survives, no diary, no confession, no words at all, only silence. And silence can mean more than concealment. It can mean absence. What if she was not orchestrator, but prisoner, bound to the role that consumed those around her? A mask, yes, but a mask cannot choose the face it hides. Perhaps she too was caught in the system, forced into repetition, compelled by forces larger than her will. The very inevitability that enslaved her community may have enslaved her as well. Think of the doctor's words, she did not age. Was this the sign of dark power or of imprisonment? To be frozen in time, unchanged across decades, while everyone around you withers and vanishes, that is not freedom, that is captivity, an endless performance, marriage after marriage, disappearance after disappearance. What others saw as survival may have been her sentence, an eternity of widowhood, of silence, until the machine no longer needed her and consumed her in turn. The phrase transferred, location withheld, takes on new meaning under this light. Not an erasure she commanded, but an erasure inflicted upon her. She was not removed because she triumphed. She was removed because her role was complete. The mask discarded once the ritual was finished. The inevitability that claimed 12 men finally claimed her too, not as punishment, but as completion. And here lies the most chilling thought. Perhaps she was never human at all, not in the way we understand it. Perhaps she was a vessel filled, emptied, and refilled across decades. An eternal widow, a face chosen to repeat the ritual of disappearance until the machine shifted its mask elsewhere. That is why she left no aging body behind. That is why her census entry ended not with deceased, but with transferred. The vessel was moved, the ritual continued, somewhere else, with someone else. But what if she was aware? Imagine the torment of knowing your presence was death, of watching each man who touched your hand vanish into silence, powerless to stop it. Imagine neighbors crossing the street to avoid your gaze, whispers staining your name, the weight of inevitability pressing down upon you. If she was conscious, she lived not as predator, but as sacrifice, an endless repetition of marriage and loss, condemned by forces she could neither resist nor escape. Do you see it? The story is not about one woman devouring men, it is about a system devouring everyone, men, women, communities. She was not outside it, he was inside it. The difference is that her survival was visible, their erasure was invisible, and when at last her usefulness ended, she joined them in the same silence. That is why this history is forbidden, because it shatters the illusion of agency. It reveals that even those who appear powerful may be nothing but pawns, masks worn by the machine. It forces you to ask the most dangerous question of all. If she was a prisoner, if she too was bound by inevitability, then what does that say about us? About you? About the roles you perform, the silences you obey, the repetitions you call destiny? Her neighbors accepted inevitability, her husbands surrendered to it, and she, the widow who never aged, endured it until the system erased her as cleanly as the rest. This is not a story of one cursed woman. It is a mirror. It shows us how power uses us all, as pawns, as vessels, as sacrifices. So the next time you see inevitability repeated in your life, cycles of silence, patterns of disappearance, histories rewritten by institutions, ask yourself, are you outside of it? Or are you already inside, already performing the role assigned to you, already being carried toward erasure under the illusion of choice? Because if she was not free, neither are you. Her silence was not an ending. It was a beginning. What happened in Kansas was not a closed chapter, but a prototype, a rehearsal for the machinery that would define America's hidden history, the art of selective memory. Because what is erasure if not the weaponization of forgetting? And what is history if not the illusion that forgetting never happened? Think of the way her story survives today. Not in official records, not in courthouse archives, not in church registers. It survives in fragments. Oral testimonies, stray letters, receipts without graves, a census line replaced with a phrase that should not exist. Transferred, location withheld. That is not history. That is ghost work. A residue left behind after institutions have already buried the truth. Now look at the wider stage. Throughout the late 19th century, America perfected this kind of silence. Newspapers rose as the supposed guardians of public memory, yet their silence was louder than their ink. The widow's story only reached print after 9 husbands had vanished. Why? Because silence sells better than scandal when scandal threatens institutions. And once the press touched it, the story was reduced to a headline, a curiosity, a ghost story stripped of teeth. Cursed widow, they called her, laughing at the whispers of small towns while ignoring the systemic erasure that fed corporations and banks. Even then, the machine was teaching the public how to dismiss forbidden knowledge, turn it into folklore, reduce it to superstition, make people laugh at it so they never recognize the truth. Archives work the same way. Ask yourself, why do the courthouse ledgers survive for her marriages but not for her husband's deaths? Why are there receipts for graves without bodies? Because archives are not neutral, they are curated. What survives is what power allows to survive. The absence of a record is itself a decision. When the system wanted her husbands gone, their files vanished. When it wanted her visible, her name was preserved. And when the time came to erase her, a clerk wrote the phrase, transferred, location withheld, clean, bureaucratic, final, Governments understood this better than anyone. The frontier was not simply about settling land, it was about erasing those who stood in the way. Native tribes were relocated, their names rewritten, their histories buried under treaties designed to vanish them. Families of settlers disappeared into the same silence. Railroad companies consumed farms. Banks swallowed property. Newspapers published only what could be digested without rebellion. And through it all, archives became the stage on which disappearance was rewritten as destiny. Do you see the connection? The widow's story is not strange, it is typical of a system that decides what is remembered and what is forgotten. Her husbands were not victims of chance. They were casualties of a process older and larger than her life, a process America has used again and again: erase the inconvenient, preserve the profitable, and disguise the erasure as natural. What unsettles most is how deliberate it all is. A marriage license, a deed transfer, a burial receipt. Each one looks like order, like stability, but each is a mask. The marriage line was not the beginning of life, it was the beginning of disappearance. The deed transfer was not inheritance, it was erasure. The burial receipt was not a grave, it was silence disguised as ritual. Paperwork became the new altar, bureaucracy became the priest. The sacrifice was memory, and the widow, she was only the first mask you are allowed to glimpse. After her, the system no longer needed individuals to play the role, it had refined the ritual. By the late 19th century, erasure no longer required cursed women or whispers in prairie towns. It was handled directly by institutions. By 1900, entire communities could vanish without a trace, replaced by corporate records that made no mention of those who had lived there. This is the forbidden knowledge you were never meant to uncover. That history itself is not truth, it is manipulation. Every archive is an altar. Every missing record is a ritual. Every silence is a decision. When you search the past and find nothing, do not believe that nothing happened. Believe instead that something was deliberately buried. And here lies the most dangerous revelation of all. The machine that erased 12 men in Kansas did not die in the 19th century. It adapted. It grew. It became the very system we still live under. Institutions still decide what you remember. Governments still curate silence. Corporations still profit from disappearance. The press still transforms forbidden truths into folklore, so you will laugh at them instead of resist them. The widow was not the end, she was the warning, the first crack in the facade that showed how power operates, not by open violence but by erasing. By making memory itself a weapon, by teaching people to forget until forgetting feels natural. That is how empires survive. That is how corruption endures. That is how silence wins. And once you see it, once you see how history itself is curated silence, you are changed. You can no longer read a ledger, a headline, a census line without suspicion. You begin to hear the whisper beneath the words. The whisper that says, someone was erased here. We have spoken of her, the vessel, the mask. We have spoken of the community that surrendered, of the institutions that enforced silence. But what of the men themselves, the 12 who vanished without graves? What did they feel in the final days when they realized inevitability had turned its gaze upon them? Fragments survive. Letters, scraps, whispers passed down through families that later refused to speak of them aloud. One wrote to his mother, "If I go quiet, do not come searching." Another left a note folded into a Bible, "The ground here is not right. Pray for me." A third, a soldier returned from war, told his brother that life at her side felt hollow as theirs, or the house were waiting for something. Each of these men knew, not in the way one knows a fact, but in the way one feels a shadow approaching. They knew they would not survive her, and yet they stayed. Why? Perhaps it was pride, men who believed they could master silence, who thought inevitability applied to others but not to them. Perhaps it was desire. She was young, striking, untouched by age, a figure who seemed eternal while others withered. Perhaps it was simply the absence of alternatives. In the raw frontier of Kansas, land and companionship were scarce. A widow with property was opportunity. Many men believed they were marrying security, They were marrying disappearance. But their letters reveal something more chilling, a sense of inevitability that had already seeped into their bones. They did not write of fighting it, they wrote of submitting to it. If I go quiet, do not come searching. That is not a man preparing to resist. That is a man preparing to vanish. The ritual had already consumed his will. This is the deepest level of psychological control, when victims not only surrender but anticipate their own erasure, when men no longer believe survival is possible, when they step willingly into silence, convinced resistance is futile. That is the point where power no longer needs to act. The pattern enforces itself. Neighbors later claimed they heard nothing unusual, no screams, no struggles. And perhaps that is the most terrifying detail of all. Because if the men knew and if they surrendered, then silence itself became the ritual. No blood, no violence, no graves, only disappearance, quiet and complete. Some families tried to resist. A brother rode into town demanding answers. He wrote later, "This matter is not for court nor for scripture." Why not? Because the institutions were already complicit. The courthouse would not listen, the church would not bless, the sheriff would not search. To press further was to invite one's own erasure, and so even the families of the vanished surrendered, swallowing silence rather than risking its contagion. The vanished men became shadows in their own homes. Oral accounts describe their last days as restless, withdrawn. One neighbor remembered a husband standing in the field at dusk, staring at the horizon, not working, not speaking, as though already half absorbed by absence. Another recalled hearing a man pray loudly in the night, but never in church, and then gone. No body, no grave, only her name remained. Think of the terror of living like that, knowing you are marked for disappearance, yet unable to escape. Men on the frontier had faced war, famine, drought, violence. But this was worse. At least war leaves graves. At least famine leaves memory. This left nothing. Erasure is more frightening than death because it denies you even the dignity of being remembered. And these men felt that inevitability pressing on them, suffocating them until they accepted it as their end. And yet, there is another possibility. What if some of them did resist? What if their letters were warnings, attempts to break the silence? What if their brothers, their families, their neighbors buried those warnings out of fear? In that case, the silence is not only the absence of resistance, it is the destruction of resistance. The system devoured not only the men but their voices, leaving only fragments that survived by accident. This is why their words are so haunting, because in those fragments you hear the faint echo of rebellion quickly swallowed, "Do not come searching," and that is both surrender and warning, a plea to stay alive, by not confronting the abyss. The men knew the silence would spread, and they chose to let it take them, rather than see it take their families too. That is not cowardice, that is sacrifice. 12 men, 12 silences, 12 erasures, each one reinforcing the inevitability, each one feeding the ritual. Their lives became currency, traded not for memory but for land, for power, for the continued functioning of the machine. They did not die in war. They did not fall to illness. They were consumed by silence itself. And perhaps the most disturbing truth is this: their erasure worked. Look around you. Do you know their names? No. You know hers. The widow survives in memory because she was the mask. They are gone because they were the sacrifice. That is the cruelest symmetry of all. You have followed her through silence. You have seen the husbands vanish, the neighbors surrender, the institutions comply. You have seen the land shift, the receipts survive without graves, the census line that ends with a phrase that should not exist. Transferred. Location withheld. But now we come to the most dangerous truth of all. The ritual never ended. What consumed 12 men in Kansas was not an isolated curse. It was not a woman's cunning or a small-town superstition. It was a system of erasure, silence, inevitability. And that system did not die with her disappearance. It grew, it refined itself, it became invisible. Today it wears new masks. You see it in archives where entire families vanish from records without explanation. You see it in newspapers that reduce scandals to curiosities, stripping them of power. You see it in corporations that absorb lives and leave behind nothing but profit margins. You see it in governments that rewrite events, that decide what is remembered and what is forgotten. The same silence that devoured her husbands now devours millions. The ritual continues. And here is the part that should make your blood run cold. You are inside it. Every time you accept a story without questioning what has been left out, you submit to the silence. Every time you read a headline and laugh off the strange, the forbidden, the inconvenient, you feed the ritual. Every time you forget a name, a face, a truth that once mattered, you become the vessel through which erasure works. The silence no longer requires a widow in Kansas. It requires you. It requires your compliance. Do you see now why this knowledge is dangerous? Because once you recognize the pattern, you cannot return to sleep. You begin to hear the whispers behind the headlines, the missing pieces in the archives, the questions the institutions will never answer. You see the graves that were never dug, the names that were never recorded, the truths that were deliberately buried. You realize that history itself is not memory, it is design, and you understand that you are not outside of it. You are living inside the machine. The widow's story is a mirror. It forces you to confront the inevitabilities in your own life. How many silences have you accepted as natural? How many repetitions have you mistaken for destiny? How many names have you allowed to vanish because asking about them felt dangerous? That is how the ritual survives, not by killing bodies, but by teaching minds to accept erasure as fate. But here is the forbidden secret. Inevitability is a lie. It only feels unbreakable because it has been repeated enough to harden into belief. The truth is that silence survives only when no one names it. The moment you name it, the moment you refuse to forget, the ritual begins to crack. That is why her husbands wrote warnings. That is why her brother whispered, "This matter is not for court nor for scripture." They knew, they saw, they understood that silence was the weapon and that breaking it was the only act of resistance. So I ask you now, not as a storyteller, but as the voice pulling you down into this knowledge, will you surrender to inevitability or will you resist? If you are ready to resist, prove it. In the comments, write the phrase, "I break the silence twice." Not once, twice. Do it as a signal, as a refusal, as the mark that you will not be erased. Write it to show that you are awake, that you have heard the truth, that you will carry it forward. Because this is not just a story about 1876 Kansas, it is the story of every system that survives by erasing the inconvenient, by burying the unprofitable, by silencing the forbidden. It is the story of history itself. And it is the story of you, right now, listening to this, deciding whether to obey the silence or to resist it. Remember, the widow was not free, the husbands were not free, the community was not free, but you can be, if you choose to see, if you choose to remember, if you choose to break the silence. The ledger is still open, the ritual is still running, the machine is still feeding, but tonight you have seen what was never meant to be seen. And that knowledge changes you forever. You were never meant to hear this, but now you have, and nothing will ever be the same.